In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the Arduino programming environment, and we're going to take a look at our very first program here. So I kind of talked about this a little bit in the last video, but programming is essentially how we tell computers what we want them to do, right? It's this agreed upon language that we're using where it kind of looks a little bit more readable to us humans, and then the computer will then translate it down to the very low level stuff that executes on that chip, that's telling the specific little pieces inside of that chip how to move. And so programming languages have a lot of the same pieces as natural languages, right? So there are words used to represent abstract concepts. There's somewhat an idea of sentences and that we string together multiple words to create complete statements. We use punctuation and formatting to kind of break up these sentences and show, some forms of like kind of paragraphs you can think about. And we also have like syntax and semantics. So syntax is the structure of language, and here I have an example of something that kind of makes sense a little bit, but syntactically it's not quite correct, right? So me speak good English, right? You can understand what I'm saying, but syntactically that's not correct, right? You can kind of think about that as a little bit of like the grammar. And then we have semantics, which is more the meaning of language, right? So this sentence is in Italian, right? That is syntactically correct, right? There's nothing grammatically wrong about it, but semantically it doesn't make sense. So there's a lot of stuff that we'll have to think about when we're writing languages that is similar to this, right? We're going to have to think about the syntax of the programming language, and we're going to have to think about the semantics, or what we mean when we write these certain things. And then again, kind of going back to us talking about what a computer is, right? It's a dumb machine, right? We need to give it a program which is a step-by-step set of instructions of what we want it to do, right? So we have to really explicitly tell it what we want it to do, or else it's not going to be able to do it properly. So the Arduino programming language is like a special subset of some other different languages. It's basically kind of the C programming language combined with some aspects of C++, plus some specific additions to make it a little bit easier to use the Arduino platform, right? So like I said, there's like this huge 660 page like data sheet for that little chip that would give you all the nitty-gritty details, but Arduino has kind of done a lot of work to abstract away a lot of that to make it a little bit more accessible and help us so that we can like hit the ground running and start creating cool stuff pretty close to immediately, right? And so C and C++ are considered like higher level languages, right? They have some expressiveness in that, we can give kind of intuitive names to stuff, and it's not too concerned about the underlying hardware. And as we look at our first program, you'll see that, even though you might not fully understand everything that's going on, it's a little bit comprehensible, right? It looks somewhat like English. And then the last thing is that it is compiled. And so that's that process I've been talking about, where we go from the high level language down to the very low level stuff. Something called a compiler takes our code and translates it into that like binary stuff that's running on those individual little circuits inside of the chip. And then this is a very helpful reference guide that we're going to refer to a lot that has kind of everything you need to know about the Arduino programming language. So this is what it looks like, and I would recommend like bookmarking this, because this is going to be very helpful for us as we're kind of moving on throughout this. So let's take a look at our first program here. So I'm going to pull up my Arduino environment. So I'm using the Arduino IDE version 2, which has a lot of great new features above the version 1. And so this is kind of our first program here. There's some things I think that would jump out at you right away. So there's all this stuff in green here. So all of these stuff here in green doesn't really look much like programming, because it's not. These are just comments that I have added in there that are completely ignored by the computer and by the Arduino. These are just notes that I've put in there for myself to kind of describe what the program's doing and let me know what's going on. And adding comments into your code can be very helpful, because if you ever stop with a project and then come back, it kind of lets you know where you left off. But it also like allows you to maybe like copy and paste things from some other program where you did something similar into a new program. So I would recommend doing that. But yeah, so when the computer compiles this program and sends it to the Arduino, all of this stuff in green is entirely ignored. And so there's kind of a couple forms of comments here, right? So there's this big thing here that's called a block comment, where I start it with a slash star and end it with a star slash, and everything between those characters there is ignored by the program and is part of the comment. So if I got rid of this last one here, it thinks the whole thing is part of it. So I need to have both the start and the end there. Then there are like kind of these single line comments where anything after two forward slashes here is going to be a comment, right? So I could do it here for like a single line, or I could do it after some line of code here. And so yeah, these are all kind of comments here. And as we're looking through this, we could just look at the comments to get some idea of what's going on here. So it says put your setup code here to run once, and put your main code here to run repeatedly. That's one thing that I'm picking up on. And in fact, if I went to File and I hit New Sketch, we're gonna see those two chunks of code in the program already. So every new sketch is gonna have these two key pieces, and this is called our setup, and this is called our loop. And so all of our programs are gonna need to have that. And this is kind of fundamental to how the Arduino works. So our setup is responsible for, like, what we're gonna do is we can kind of think about these as the paragraphs that I mentioned before, right? So between these two little curly braces here is gonna be all of the code that we want to run once right at the very beginning when the Arduino is powered on and once it starts doing its thing. This is gonna set up everything about, you know, what we want our program to do and like how our circuit's set up and things like that. Then here inside of loop, inside of like this paragraph here, we're gonna put our main code, it says here, to run repeatedly. So what happens is the Arduino comes here, it goes into setup and it runs all the code there, and then after it's done with that code, it then runs each line of code inside of loop, and once it hits the end of loop, it goes right back up to the top and goes over and over and over again. And it never stops. It never stops until you unplug it or disconnect power from the Arduino. And then if you were to reconnect power again, what would happen is it would go back to setup, then go through loop, and then just keep going through loop over and over and over again. So that's how this works. And so every time you open up a new sketch, this is what it's gonna look like. Well, let's go back now to our original one here and take a look at a few more things that are going on. So inside of setup, we can see something about, it says initialize serial communications at 9600 bits per second. So we might not recognize all those words, but that's fine. We're gonna dive into this in more detail later. But what we can see is there's kind of a one-to-one mapping here. I've added like a comment right before a line of code, kind of describing what that line of code does. And so the serial stuff is how we send information to the computer. And so that's what that's doing here. And then it's saying here that it's initializing a digital pin 13 as an output. So we talked about digital pins and we talked about how they could be used as an output. So this line of code here is setting up that digital pin to be an output. And then here we have, it says some welcome message, right? And then if we go down into our loop where it's the main code that's gonna run repeatedly, even if we don't understand all of this, you can start to take a look, and this says turn the LED on, tell the PC the LED is on, wait for 1 second, turn the LED off, tell the PC the LED is off, and then wait for a second. So just by looking at the comments, we can kind of see what's going on. So before we dive into it in a little bit more detail here, let's try to put this program here onto my Arduino. So so right now, let me disconnect it. I'm gonna connect it via the USB cord here. So if I go to here, you can see I have this cord here. The other end of it's connected up to my computer. And once I plugged it in, it shows up here. It recognized my Arduino Uno, and I just need to select it there. And then there's two buttons right here. There's this verify button, and what that does is it will just check for any errors in my program, and it will let me know if there's any errors here. So it said it was fine, it's happy with it, and so what I can do is I can hit this arrow that goes to the right that says upload. And what that means is it's sending code now to the Arduino to actually start running on it. So when I hit upload, it says compiling sketch, it's going to the compiler, it says done compiling, and now it says uploading, and now it says done uploading. So that program should be running over here on the Arduino. So let's flip over to here. And it does say it's turning on an LED. And so if we looked at the code, it would say something about the LED being connected to pin 13. So Arduino provided this tiny little LED that's on there that has the L next to it that's blinking on and off as a nice way to just be able to test your Arduino to make sure everything's working so that I don't have to connect anything external to it. And so we see that it's blinking on and off every second here, which was something that we saw in the comments kind of describing what's going on. So it does seem like this program's on here and it's working. The other thing you'll notice is that this little on light is on, and that's any time that there's power routed to this. We also see that this TX light is on, which stands for transmit, meaning that right now the Arduino is currently transmitting information to the computer through the USB port. So the way to see that information, which is coming through the serial port, which is what this is referred to, is if I go back here and I scroll up here and I go to this little magnifying glass, and it's called the serial monitor. If I click on that, we can see messages starting to come in here. So first, this is just kind of some gibberish from when it uploaded, but it first says I'm alive, and now it's saying on off every second, corresponding to when the light is on or off on the Arduino board. And so if we look at our code here in a bit more detail, we see that within setup, it's beginning the serial port, configuring or initializing that digital pin to be an output where the LED is connected, and then saying I'm alive, right? It says that once at the very beginning, and then it's going to say on off for the rest of time until I remove power from it. And so we can see that here it says something about this line turns on the LED, then it sends the on message, and then there's this delay 1000, and it says wait for 1 second. So what this delay line is doing is it's waiting for 1000 milliseconds before it goes on to the next one, and then it turns the LED off and then says off and then waits again for another 1000 milliseconds. And then once we reach the end of loop, it goes right back up to the top and repeats over and over and over again. So even though we don't perfectly understand every little individual line of code, we can start to understand a little bit of what's going on here. So the last pieces here that are not part of the chunk here, this setup, and this chunk here, the loop, which we kind of are calling paragraphs right now, but we'll get into more of what those are later. There is this stuff up here. And so here I just have a comment that says include a random library for example purposes. So a library is just a name for somebody's code that they have written somewhere else, right? So it comes from historically when you would go look up somebody's code in the library and copy it into your environment. Now we can download it from the internet and include it into our project. And so when I say pound include like this, and then I say the name of the library, what it's doing is it's including that person's library in here. And what that library is just some code that I don't have to rewrite for myself. Maybe, they wrote some code for dealing with a specific sensor, and it's just really useful to be able to, not have to reinvent the wheel and use their library. So this is how you would do that. The last piece here is this pound define. This is what's known as a macro, which is a way of representing some value with a name, a more intuitive name here. And so what I'm doing is I'm representing some value 13 as LED pin. And what that does is allow me to use this word in place of 13 throughout the program, because that's going to make a little bit more sense to me. So down here, when I'm saying turn the LED pin high or the LED pin low, if I just had 13 here, and maybe I just had a bunch of other stuff connected up to my Arduino, it would be hard for me to keep track of what's connected to which pin and what's going on. But I don't have to keep track of that now. I can just say, oh, hey, I know that my LED pin, I defined it up here as being pin 13. Down here, what I can do is just say LED pin. I don't have to remember the specific number I connected it to. Or if later on I want to connect it to another pin, I can just change it in one single place as opposed to everywhere. So that's what this is for. It's called a pound define or a macro, and it's a way of defining some constant value, in this case the constant value 13, as, some word. Typically we use all uppercase to indicate that it's a constant and that it doesn't change, it's some macro. And then we can use its name anywhere in the code, and when it sends the program to the computer, it will automatically replace this name with the number 13 so that the Arduino knows specifically what we're talking about. But this is just a nice shorthand for us so we know a little bit about what's going on. And so yeah, that's kind of like the nuts and bolts of this first program here. What we're going to do is we'll talk about more of these individual pieces and what they are and how to create our own programs, but I wanted you to just get kind of a look and feel for what this program is and how it works.